100 years ago, in November 1918, the guns fell silent on the Western Front. 6 months later, New Zealand was one of many nations that signed the peace treaty at Versailles in France. After 4 terrible years, the war was over. But for many, it never truly ended.
So we're talking about William Arthur Ham, who was my great-granduncle. So he was my grandmother's father's brother. We always understood that Willie was the first New Zealander killed in the First World War, so first person to die.
About 3/4 of the way across, Ham, who was in front of me, dropped, shot in the neck. He was groaning badly, so I crept back and made him as comfortable as possible. He could speak, and he said he'd lost the power of his arms and legs, so I knew the bullet must have lodged in the spinal column and so paralysed him.
Because Willie was so early in the war, I don't think they'd set up the systems to notify family members, and I think they published it in the news, and they just found out through word of mouth, like, hey, is that your brother that died? Well, yeah, must have been, you know.
Māori Member of Parliament Sir Maui Pomare and his influential wife Lady Miria were at the forefront of the Māori and Pacific Islands' contribution to the war.
I think when Sir Maui was given this job to do, and he did it with pride, and he did it with dignity, and he did it with conviction, she too took up the cause in her own way. He, on the one hand, was recruiting them to send them off to war, and she, on the other, was trying to look after them.
Joyful and grateful as our own boys are when opening a parcel of cakes, sweets or socks, the joy of our Māori men when finding mutton birds, toheroa and other delicacies could be painted by an artist.
My father was born in 1896. By the time World War I began, he was a 18-year-old. He went pretty well straight from school into the army, and by the time he was 19, he was at Gallipoli.
I have remembered this distinctly all my life, that lying there completely exhausted, I almost fell asleep in all the din and heat, and that in the moments of only semi-consciousness, I actually wished I could die.
Private Frank Tararo was one of 500 Cook Islanders to sign up as reinforcements for the Māori battalion. He was helping to dig an 8-kilometre communications trench along the front lines at the Somme.
When he was wounded, and not just him, but a number of others that were wounded, he laid there for days.
My lower arm and my hand had been shredded by exploding shrapnel. I was lucky though, because the cold, wintry conditions stopped the infection and gangrene from setting into my wounds. When help finally arrived, they were shocked to find that some of us were still alive.
He was the only one that went to the First World War from our island that actually returned home.
Deborah Pitts-Taylor drives ambulances in England. The Kiwi girl is treated as one of the boys.
The mere fact of my being a New Zealand girl was enough for them to take me to their clan, so to speak. They treat a New Zealand girl quite differently. It's very funny.
So we grew up hearing stories about Deborah Taylor, and we knew that she was an ambulance driver in World War I. And I think that was quite an exciting thing to know about one of your ancestors.
Her brother George was killed in December 1917, and I've got the diary entry of the day she heard the news.
14th December 1917. Somehow I felt afraid last night, and I put it down to the dread of bad news. I went to work and a wire was handed to me. Oh, it was awful. Just full of official wording that George had died of wounds in France.
And then her youngest brother, who she was very close to, because they were the two youngest in the family, was killed at the Somme in March 1918, and he was just 21.
Chinese-Irish New Zealanders, the Singh brothers, came from a long line of military men. As soon as war was declared, 4 of the 5 fighting Singhs signed up.
Everybody would have been, I guess, going to war. There's a certain amount of venture involved. You know, we're a bit gung-ho, we're going to go out there and we're going to do it, deal to them, we're going to do it for king and country. But when you get there, the reality really has to set in, because There's people falling around all around you. You know, you're losing your mates, and it'd be chaotic. The noise would be chaotic.
We could pick out which were explosive bullets, pom-poms and shrapnel. The explosive bullets give a soft hiss and then crack. Then the pom-poms start just to give a little change. They just go boom, boom, boom all the time. The ordinary bullet goes by with a soft shells, just the opposite. They screech and whistle and scream, then
Quite spooky the way it was written, really, wasn't it? And to his mum, you know.
New Zealand's most famous conscientious objector, Archibald Baxter, had no choice. He was one of 4 pacifists who were physically forced to go to the front.
As far as military service goes, I'm of the same mind as ever. It is impossible for me to serve in the army. I would 1,000 times rather be put to death.
Archibald was on the front lines in a situation of total war, which is what the Great War was, refusing to fight and being tortured for doing so, but never giving in.
Hamilton nurse Louisa Higginson's 3 brothers had already enlisted. New Zealand wasn't sending nurses to the war, so she made her own way there.
She wasn't going to let the brothers go without her, and she felt she was the only one that could look after them, which is jolly well was, I think.
Sir Frederick Treves came round the hospital today and he was pleased with it. He also asked Matron who her nurses were. She told him that 2 of her best were New Zealanders, and he said that New Zealand nurses were good and practical.
And then she was given the position of being in charge of a prisoner of war camp, and they were German prisoners.
I feel so disgusted and ashamed to think I have to nurse the Huns. This is what I paid my fare and came 16,000 miles for. It is a beautiful place and should be used for our boys.
But she would do her duty, and she did.
It was only a few weeks previous to this that Herbert made a name for himself in a strafe. He was on duty at the telephone when the wire was broken on 3 different occasions.
I believe he was trying to get this thing to work again in the field, and he was taken out.
He was a great loss to us all and his comrades, for he had many, and he was well liked. But it's hard, Mother, to bear our loss bravely.
He was a fighting thing to the end for sure, you know, and brave as going out there doing it.
I'm sure there were regrets. You know, I'm sure she had a real empathy, as Samawi did, with the Waikato people, with the Taranaki people, his people, you know, who struggled with the notion of sending their sons to fight a Pākehā war on the other side of the world.
They had to help with their physical wounds, but their psychological wounds really remained, and remained perhaps down through the generations.
I think asking the question, for Deborah to ask the question, was it worth it? That is a question that's too painful for her to even ask, let alone answer.
With the stories we heard, we just wondered why they went, and I often think even now, I doubt whether the males of the country will think about going to war now. No.
I think it was important, and I think they were brought up in a way that they respected the king and country.
By signing up to the treaty, you know, Aotearoa, they believed we were linking Aotearoa with the British Empire, and we had an obligation.
That not to go is not to support or not to be helping or being part of what a lot of other people have no choice about being part of.
I've always found Anzac Day quite challenging growing up. It's always grated with me a bit, and that's not because I don't think that we should be remembering or commemorating World War I. I absolutely think we should be, to learn those lessons.
I see the First World War as a futile war of waste and horror and destruction.
When those lists Māori, deaths were first released, I think she and Maui would have felt a very, very personal and deep sense of loss.
I have to think about my sons and my daughter. I would not. I would probably be the parent that would be standing there and saying, no, this is not our war.
A sea of boys, a sea of men, and there was Willie, like this one little face. And how did that person find him, And it's like, how dare we have this amazing story when all these other families have no records, no story, no ability to find out who their ancestors were, because they were just one of 18,000,